Dr. Levine, thank you so much for joining us on the Stop Chasing Pain podcast. It is an honor to have you on my show, sir.
Okay. Yeah, good to
So,
be.
yeah, it's wonderful to have you here. I have to tell we were talking a little bit before we came on, and you've been a very big influence on me personally and professionally, helping myself get through a lot of my own issues and then working with clients in my Stop Chasing Pain Center outside of New York City. And we're going to talk today about your brand new book, which congratulations. So happy for you. Well deserved. I know you put a lot of work into that. And I read all of your other books as well. I can add it to my arsenal that I have. And the title of the book, I love it, is An Autobiography of Trauma, Healing Journey. And I would imagine that this has probably got to have a special place in your heart on this one. And did you find it easy or difficult to write this chapter?
Very difficult. Very difficult. I mean, I've written, I get 10 or 12 books.
Yeah, a bit.
And and they've taken a lot of energy, a lot of work, and they're mostly about theory and like case examples, that kind of thing. But this was a whole other project for me. It actually didn't start as a book. I'll tell you how it started. I'm at the age where I clearly, even if I have lived a long time and healthy, vibrant, I have many less years ahead of me than I had behind me from my conception to where I am right now. So what I only meant to do this as a personal excavation, that I was doing this for myself as a way of kind of really revisiting my life and finding its trajectory. And so I started with that in mind. I had no thought really about making it as a book. Well, a very close friend of mine, I showed it to her, and obviously somebody that I really trusted, and she said, "Peter, you really need to be writing this as a book." And I remember thinking, no way, it's too personal, it's too raw, it's too vulnerable.
Mm.
And she said, well, I hope you really think about it, because if I think it could help a lot of people with their own healing because of those reasons. So
Yes.
again, I couldn't wrap my head around that, my heart around that. So often, she said, well, why don't you think about it and just see how it feels, maybe, to be writing a book, to use it to write a book. And so often when I got to an impasse, or I have some kind of a conflict, or don't know what my next step might be, often I'll have dreams or synchronicities, coincidences of people I happen to meet, all of a sudden seemingly out of nowhere. So anyhow, I would say ambivalent at most. I really was very conflicted about actually making this into a book that other people would read.
Mm.
And they would know some of the backstory, but they would also get to know me in a deeper way. So anyhow, often when I'm at a place of indecision or conflict, or don't know what my next step is, I'll often have a dream. And I did have this dream during that time. And in the dream, I'm facing an open field. And in my hands, I have a manuscript. And I'm looking at it from the left and the right, left. And clearly I'm conflicted. I don't know what I want to be doing, what I need to be doing. So in those moments of indecision, all of a sudden this wind, this breeze came from behind me and took all of these pages and then just scattered them in the wind, scattered them to the land where they might land. And when I woke from the dream and wrote the dream down, some dreams are very clear. This one was pretty clear. The decision was being made by me, for me, from my unconscious. because often as smart as we are, our unconscious mind is often much smarter.
Mm.
So that's how I got started. Uh, it just came that this could be something, like my friend said, that could help people with their own healing, to tell their own stories, maybe even to write their own stories. So even though I had anxiety, I was willing to go forward. And so I did. So it took me almost a couple of years to write the book. And actually, the first time I said anything about it in public, there's a, a, a conference called the Evolution of Psychotherapy, and usually there's between 5,000 and 8,000 people there. So I'm standing in front of this audience of some thousand people, and the words wouldn't come. My constricted. But then I remembered some of the things that people have written about the book, about me, about the book. And I really felt them standing by my side,
Mm.
and also at my back, like having a on my back to support me. And so feeling that support and feeling their caring and feeling their acknowledgement of this work, I was able then to start speaking. And now I've been able to speak to different people, different organizations.
Mm.
And, I'm trying to think, it doesn't feel difficult anymore. It did for a while, but it seems like for each interview, I meet somebody interesting. I talk about things maybe in a slightly different way. And so in a way, it's like I'm continuing the book writing of the book right now with you and with the other people that I've just talked to. Just early this morning, talked to a French organization. And I really enjoyed just being with them and then just hanging out. So I think that's where I am right now in in my work, in the book, in writing the book.
Thank you very much for sharing that. That was lovely. Lovely. I'm curious. I would imagine that I mean, there's certainly a vulnerability to that, right? Putting yourself out there. And yeah, how can I say this? It's like, when you've put so much out there to help other people, right, with the work that you've done, it's almost like they think, well, you've got it all figured out. You don't have any problems left, right?
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely yes on the vulnerability. And have I figured everything out? No, but I've made good steps.
Mm.
You know, oh gosh, about 35 years ago, I was experiencing different kind of, well, disturbing sensations and um, and I realized that something was coming up. So
Mm.
I thought this is a time for me to take a dose of my own medicine. So I asked
Ah.
one of my students to guide me to work with these sensations and to see where they might lead.
Mm.
And so she agreed. And in somatic experiencing, you probably know we don't go right for the jugular vein of the trauma. We don't go right for the core of the trauma. I think the therapies that have people relive their traumas over and over and over again, I don't think they're often not helpful, sometimes problematic.
Yeah.
So we're looking at experiences in the body that contradict those of terror, helplessness, overwhelming helplessness, and so forth. So you build a new model in the nervous system.
Mm.
So what came up when my therapist, my guide, was following me, an image came up of when I was about 4 or 5, and it was my birthday. And in the middle of the night or early in the morning, my parents must have come into my room and laid a train track, a model train track underneath my bed, out into the room, back, and then again into in an oval, getting back into, under the bed again. And so when I awoke, the train was going around on the tracks. And to say I was in ecstasy would be an understatement. Immediately, literally jumped out of bed, went to the transformer so I could control the speed of the train. I can have an image of that transformer and the train with the Lionel train set. And in that moment, I didn't have the words for it because horrible things happen, and this will lead into it. That I knew that I was cared about, that I was loved.
Mm.
Oh, and even if we've only had one experience of being cared for, being supported, being loved, that can make all the difference in our lives and in our therapy. It's really I mean, there's some research on this. It's in a way, I mean, it's understandable. It's remarkable. It's also unremarkable that when we can, but the missing piece is that we have to be able to feel that in our bodies. So my guide then really encouraged me to feel more and more my excitement, my energy, my being cared for, and experience it in the body. You know, there's a saying in Papua New Guinea that if a knowledge does not exist in the body, then it does not exist. If it's not in the muscles, it doesn't exist. And so that's an essential part. So then after this and feeling this sense of aliveness, vitality, being cared for, the next thing was she was noticing a very slight shuffling of my feet. And again, in somatic experiencing, we help the person slow down the experience. Because if we go at it too fast, then we really don't grasp it. So I could feel my feet just very slowly moving as though they were walking or running. And then the following positive image came up. When I get home from junior high school, the 8th grade, I would come home, I'd have my milk and cookies, and then I would go downstairs and go across the road. And there was a park called the Reservoir Oval Park, had a tall wrought iron fence. I would climb the fence. Then there were a row of bushes would go through the bushes. Down below, there was a running track. And so she had me really embody that feeling of running. And this was so critical because this was a time when my family's life was threatened by the mafia, by a man named Johnny Dio. The DA was trying to get my father to testify against him. It's a long story. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but he just somehow got involved with this. And I mean, this man was pure evil. Oh, the movie, The Goodfellas and The Irishman, if you wanted somebody to do the bloodiest murder, that was the person who did it. And he told, and this I found out later, he had told my father that if he testified against him, that he would find his family face down in the East River. In other words, we'd be murdered. So we lived with that fear for many years. So that was going on. So when I was able to go down to the running track and start feeling the power in my legs, because having that threat with you all the time, it's like my legs got pulled out from under me. So again, in this session, feeling myself running and continuing to fall more power in my run, and my legs would start to come back to me. But then at another time, something very disturbing happened. Again, I was going home, had my milk and cookies, climbed the fence, and off to the left, there were a group of thugs, and they were smoking cigarettes and wearing these motorcycle hats. And the hairs on my neck and my back stood up. I knew that I didn't know what, but I knew something was wrong, something was serious and was dangerous. So I thought, if I go back to climb the fence, then I'm more vulnerable. So I thought I'd run down into the bushes and go to the track below as I had done before. So as I went down into the bushes, a hand grabbed me from behind and then pushed me down to the ground. And I was violently injured and raped.
Mm.
And as I figured it later on, I think that they wanted me to tell my parents what had happened as a way of knowing how they were. But I never told my parents, and I never told myself. And when I was working with my student, with my guide, she really helped me find strength in my body to counteract the violence and the rape. And in a way, with her help, I was able to put that back in where they belong, back in my memory, not something that's replaying in the present time, but putting it back where it belongs, in the back. So that was really the beginning of realizing that I did need a dose of my own medicine, that as a healer, all of us, we're really under the archetype of Chiron, which in Greek mythology was, well, my understanding of it from Greek mythology is Chiron is the wounded healer. And it's the part of all of us who are therapists or healers of different kinds that we have our own wounding. And because the word for trauma is injury or wound, the Greek word is a Greek or Latin, anyhow, it's injury or wound. And so we have our deep wounds. And when I developed somatic experiencing in the 60s and 70s, there was no definition of trauma as PTSD. It was still another 12, 14 years in the future. So I didn't know that it was supposed to be a disorder of the brain, even a brain disease, that at best could be managed with medications, and by helping people change their negative thoughts. And sometimes those can be of help, but they don't really do what's needed.
Mm-hmm.
And so in doing that, I think I became, well, one of the people who reviewed the book said, a man's searing journey from searing pain to joy, from self-hatred to self-love. And I think that was the beginning of that part of my journey, coming to safe love and deepening that in myself, but in my relationships with other people, particularly intimate relationships.
That must have been thank you very much for sharing that, by the way. That must have been something to get that help from a student, somebody who's been through your program. Talk about a full circle event,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. We always teach what we most need to learn. Then this is a primary
Yeah,
example of that,
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have to tell you, something that happened to me like that through teaching and through working with my clients. I found that people, after I gave a talk or a workshop or something,
Mhm.
the the best feedback I got and people said was, what resonated with me most, Doc, when you did it was you shared your story, that what you've been through. It wasn't so much all that information that I gave them hours after. It was
Sure.
that initial connection,
Yeah.
and then I find that that's such a missing piece in the chronic pain healthcare world, where there's a disconnect of the person behind the diagnosis, if you will.
Yeah. In a way, the backstory. And I think
Yes.
that can be helpful. And, when I wrote the book, I was concerned that it would be too much for the reader.
Hmm.
But I realized I could do a similar thing that I do in somatic experiencing with my story, so that people would be gentle to it. And again, until it came out, and then reading what, what the readers are saying about it, like on Amazon, I realized that I made the right decision.
Yep.
That people would be able to use it for their own healing. Otherwise, why bother to write it?
Yep.
And I wanted to encourage others to tell their own stories, if it's only to themselves, and to write about it, to journal it. You don't have to make a book out of it like I did. I mean, you could, of course, if you want, but I think it's such an important thing to revisit our lives, not just the traumas that happen, but the whole trajectory of our arc. Like for me, it was starting with the train set, and then another memory, similar memory, and then again coming back to dealing with what was a horrendous experience in itself, and also that the family was, that we were under life threat for such a long period of time. And my father fought it all the way to the Supreme Court. And I didn't realize that this was what was happening, but every couple of weeks on a Friday, this man came over. He was a lawyer. And I thought that he was maybe a lawyer from my father, but it turned out that he was a lawyer from the mafia, to telling my father what to say, what not to say. But me and my brothers knew something was wrong, Perry. We knew something was wrong. We could tell it from their body language, but it wasn't talked about. And that's part of the pain, that it just got, again, like my memory, it just got pushed to the side. I remember sneaking out of my room and just laying underneath a small table, a telephone table, and straining my ear to try to hear what was going on. But what I needed to hear was that, yeah, this is serious, but that will be taken care of. But they were so caught up, of course, with their own pain. I mean, that's often what happens, that they weren't able to give us any reassurance. And my father eventually did go to prison for not testifying, for pleading the Fifth Amendment, which is what the lawyer told him to do. And he spent a year and a day. And actually, the person who was with the Attorney General at that time was Robert Kennedy, very ambitious Robert Kennedy. And so he wanted to make it very punitive. So my father was a teacher and then a school principal, a high school principal. So by doing it a year and a day, he wasn't able to get a teaching license again in New York. So it was with cruelty and malice. And I remember once, I think I talk about that in the autobiography, I'm not sure. Sometimes when I'm talking, I'm not sure if it was in the autobiography or if I need to put it in for the next revision. But anyhow, I went to see him in prison. But first of all, I remember getting a letter from my mother saying that my father surrendered to the sheriff and he's now in prison. And I was at Ann Arbor, and I remember reading the letter and just sobbing, racking in pain of grief. And when I went back, I went with my mom to the prison to visit him. But the words that I needed to say couldn't come out. I couldn't say, I love you. I know this is not your fault. I just couldn't get those words out. And then when we were leaving the visiting area, so you have a big plate glass there, and then you have a microphone so you can talk back and forth. And I was leaving with my mom. And then this prison guard came over and he put his hand on my right shoulder and he said, son, I want you to know that your father's not a criminal. And indeed, my father set up a program where people could learn skills, could study skills that they could use on the outside. So we basically set up a school there. But I didn't, again, know about that until my brothers told me that much later. So again, as I just move through this arc, every time I tell it, somebody says, well, do you still have feelings? I said, yeah, I hope so. I hope I'll always have feelings. But the feelings change.
Mm.
They mutate, they transform. And I'm at the place when I'm talking now that I feel myself opening both to my pain and to my joy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he took that love that he had for teaching and education and used that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a testament to the type of man he was. I'll tell
Yes.
you what
Yeah.
really it was something really early in the book that grabbed me. And it was, I'm looking at it right now. I took a snapshot of it because I actually look at it often. And it's chapter one, born into a world of violence.
Yeah.
And it was a saying that I read. And it says it's a Jewish saying from it was a TED talk. What
Oh,
is truer than truth? Answer the story.
that's
And for
right.
some reason, I just had to sit with that for a minute because
Yeah.
that's what we've been talking about here.
That's right. Exactly. And I think that's the truth that I encourage all of you to do and explore in your life, to
Hmm.
find that deeper truth which is revealed in the story.
I love that. I just love that word story, right? Because the way I look at it is that I mean, there's I forgot who said it. It's a neuroscientist once said it. It says you can't change what happened to you, but you can change the meaning of what happened to you.
Yes.
And then that's the story you tell yourself, right?
Yeah. But I'm not sure I totally agree with that. I,
Okay.
I think you can change the story
Hmm.
the way that I was just describing, because putting together the memory, the excitement of the
Mhm.
trains and the running, and then working through the rape, being able to put it in the past where it belongs, not in the present.
Right.
And that changed. It's I can never get the right words, but it's kind of like an alchemical transformation
Hmm.
that you say, well, the memories can't change. Well, but the memories do change, but not in the way you would think. It's not like you erase the memories, but it's like intrinsically within all of us is a capacity to an instinct, a primal instinct to heal, to move towards wholeness. And I think when we enlist that, then our stories do change and they do transform.
Yeah.
So, and they belong in the past and then they can be put in the past. But until we can do that, then they keep troubling us in terms of different symptoms and sensations and feelings. Again, that's what prompted me to speak to one of my really excellent students, to ask her to sit with me, to be with me. One of the things I think it's in one of my other books, in An Unspoken Voice, How the Body Releases Trauma and Restores
Hmm.
Goodness. I say that trauma is not just what happened to us. It's not really primarily what happened to us, but it's rather what we hold inside in the absence of that present empathetic other. And that's what I would have needed from my parents when all of this was happening with the mafia. They said, we're going to protect you. We're going to take care of you.
Hmm. Right.
It would have made a big difference. And also, there's a Motown song, takes one to stand in the dark alone. It takes two to let the light shine through. And again, having that other person, that present, empathetic, connected person, let me really move through much of that trauma and then to be supported in the rest of my healing journey, a lot of it which occurred in different relationships,
Hmm.
particularly intimate relationships.
Do you find do you feel that or do you sense there's less empathy in the world today than there used to be?
Hmm. 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 less empathy in the world.
Maybe that's perception, right? Because of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
social media, just a snapshot of what we see and what we think is real.
yeah, yeah. I mean, reality is not what a concept.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, I mean, that's not an easy question to answer. But I think in some ways we are more empathetic. In other ways we've lost because, I mean, you just turn on the bloody television
Right.
and what you see, I mean, it's heartbreaking, truly, truly heartbreaking. And for example, I've worked both in Israel and in Gaza. And so
Mm.
these are people that I know or knew. And to see that repeating and repeating and repeating, I mean, it breaks my heart. And yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, I'm going to go through parts of the book here. One of the things I enjoyed all of it, but the beginning, when you started off with these wonderful pictures of people that are in places
Oh,
that
yes.
important, and I, I came across it. Holy cow! You had Ida Roth that you called Grandma. How
Right.
amazing is that? She
Yes.
is just wow.
Yes. Oh, I don't know why this happened, how this happened, karma, dharma, I don't know what it is, but somehow these people in that chapter is called the four most important women in my life. And I'm not talking about sexual partners, but people like Charlotte Selvers and Ida Rolf and Mira Rothenberg that have really made an important impact on me. They've really shaped the direction that I went in, and I want to honor them, and that's what I hope I do. I mean, I think that's what my intention was. But there was one person that was rather different, and this was a person who was no longer alive at the time. And I'll take a little time to make a kind of a side trip around this. In the early 1970s, I was starting to teach my work and try to explain what I was doing, why I was doing what I was doing, to a group of 12 or 15 Berkeley therapists. And every couple of weeks, they'd come out to they call it my treehouse in Wildcat Canyon, and I would work with people and then try to debrief what I was doing so I could train these people. I was also working on my doctoral dissertation, which was quite an ordeal. And so I had a favorite restaurant and on San Pablo Avenue called the Beggar's Banquet. And I really felt cared about when I was there. I would arrive, the waitress would greet me by name. They would sit me in my favorite table. They would start me off with a big bowl of warm soup along with some French bread, which was crispy on the outside, moist, soft on the inside. Oh, I mean, it's like all the troubles of the day just kind of
Yeah.
receded. So I'm sitting there having my soup one day, and all of a sudden I see, coming from my left, this disheveled man. He's got hair, wild, crazy hair. He's wearing a crumpled suit jacket, which is probably 2 or 3 times his size. And he kind of motions to the other chair at the table to ask me to invite him in. And so I did. Well, after a bit, I recognized that this was Albert Einstein.
Whoa.
Now, I'm not crazy. And I'm a scientist in many ways. And so I recognize this as what's called active imagination. So it was a uniting of my conscious and my unconscious mind to give me to open to creativity, which I wouldn't have been able to do without these active images, active imaginations. Well, so this went on for a good part of a year. I would ask him questions. This is most interesting. I would ask him questions and he would ask me questions about my questions. This is kind of,
I love that. That's
yeah,
great.
yeah, it's like a Socratic dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so again, this one, and some of the things that I was starting to realize in my work with people, it's not just things that happen during your lifetime that impact us, but things that happen to our parents, our grandparents, our great our ancestors. And so I brought that up to Einstein. And so as in a dream within a dream, because it's like the dream of being with Einstein, it takes me to this pond, and he has a yardstick, and all along the yardstick there are small stones. So he takes me to the pond, twists them so that the stones all fall at the same speed, and then when they hit the water, they move out in concentric rings. They move forward in time, sideways, and back in time. Well, that's definitely an Einsteinian concept, right? We're talking about space-time continuum, and time really is not being a linear sequence. So so anyhow, he then said, I said, well, what happens with the generational trauma? And he said, well, it's like two of these wave fronts get stuck. And because they get stuck, everything after that is distorted.
Mm.
And I said, well, but then how would I work with that? And he said, Peter, I don't have that answer, but you do. And he left me with that premise, which I did. I spent a good year or two really working and understanding how to work with these ancestral effects, not just of trauma, but of all kinds of other important things that are transmitted, like great amount of wisdom and kindness and so forth. So anyhow, then I left it. I assumed this was an imaginative process called active imagination. Supposedly, children lose that when they become adults. I think that's a bloody shame, because as adults, we need that more than anything else, because it really is a way, kind of an interface between the unconscious and preconscious and conscious.
Mm.
And but anyhow, I left it there. It was a certain amount of longing and sadness because I really missed our conversations. But I did continue to eat at the Beggar's Banquet for sure. Okay, so fast forward, well, 35 years ago, I was visiting my parents, and I was downtown going to museums. The end of the day, I was coming back on the D train to 205th Street, got up, walked up the hill, walked in my parents' apartment, and the two of them were sitting on a sofa. Above the sofa, there was a bookshelf. One of the books on the bookshelf that stood out was Einstein's theory of relativity. And that prompted me to tell my parents, mostly my mother, about my imaginations with Einstein many years before that. And my mother like stood up straight, and she forcefully said, Peter, I know why this happened to you. And I had no idea what she was talking about. And she went on to say, when I was pregnant with you, I was 8 months, you were 8 months in utero. And your father and I were canoeing on this lake in New Jersey. And a wind came and tipped the canoe over. And my parents couldn't ride it. And they were struggling, and they probably would have died. But then the small sailboat came along, and there was an old man and a young woman. They pulled my parents to safety and me to safety. And they introduced themselves, ready for this, as Albert Einstein and his stepdaughter.
Wow.
And yeah, and my mother realized that because Einstein and I met under a situation of life threat, that we would always be bonded, and that he would then be a guide for me. And he was. Many different times over my life, I could call on him, and he would respond. But how my mother figured that out is beyond me. I think she was a very intuitive, an amazingly intuitive person. And it's one of the gifts I think I've got from her,
Mhm.
is, to trusting my intuition, because how she made that connection was startling. Then there were a few other episodes like that that I mentioned in the book, because again, my relationships with my parents were quite troubled. But at the same time, I feel that I was gifted so many, many gifts that were important for me throughout my life. So I think, no parent is all good or all bad. But I think part of this in writing about this was to be able to hold them together, the good and the bad. And I think that was the absolute trick, to hold those polarities together. And when I thought about this, I started reading some books by Carl Jung. And he also talks about polarities, how important it is to hold together these disparate sides of a situation or of a person. So, yeah, so that was that.
Oh, that's a lovely story. Thank you. Well, Ida was very influential for me because her thinking process helped form how I look at things now and how I created Stop Chasing Pain, because one of her most famous quotes is, where you think it is, it ain't.
Yeah, right.
So it,
That's right. Ida Rolf.
yeah. Plus, she talks like me because I'm from the South and we use the word
Uh,
all the time.
yeah.
So I could gravitate towards that. And
Hmm.
that that actually leads me into something that you were mentioning before about that I noticed in the book is that and maybe it'll lead me to the other chapter I really liked about the one was a science and shamanism,
Oh, mm,
where you were not necessarily going from the typical top-down approach, right?
mm,
From here down, and you were mentioning before is that I think that we tend to use too much of the cerebral cortex in the front and think things, and we don't use that imagination part, but there's a disconnect to everything below the neck, right? Hence
yes,
the
yes, yes, yes.
somatic part.
Yeah, I mean, somatic experiencing, again, there were not, at that time, there weren't any therapies like that. I mean, when
Right.
I first published my book, well, the first published the book, tried to publish the book in 1992, and then finally in 95 or 96, I think. And at that time, there was only one other book on trauma, and that was Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery, a very important book. But now, fast forward, I would say there's not hundreds of books on trauma, probably thousands
Sure there is. Yeah.
on trauma. And so anyhow, somatic experiencing, working with sensations at the foundation,
Mm.
like a bottom-up approach, working from the foundation and then erecting the house on that foundation. And oh, where do I want to go with this? Um, and this was in contrast to most of the talk therapies, which were top down, working with thoughts and so forth. And by the way, I think that's valuable stuff also, but you need to do both. Need to also
Mm.
work with the bottom up, with the sensations, the body sensations, and then also connect them with our thoughts, with our cognitions, or with our inner images, and so forth. And so, that became like the science. And one of the things that people have said about me is that I'm a somewhat mystical person or a shamanic person. And at the time, it was important for me to get legitimacy in somatic experiencing. So I didn't really, and I regret this, I didn't really talk about how shamanism in different ways have influenced me. And I think you read that chapter in the book where I
Yeah.
really talk about what I've learned about from shamans in many different areas. And particularly what was unexpected was that their understanding of sustu, which means fright paralysis or trauma, but of community. and how important community is.
Mm.
And, you know, there's a book by, oh gosh, what's his name? Anyhow, it's the forest, the people of the forest people. And it's the Matumbu tribe, which he studied. And he's an anthropologist, but rather than just observing them and putting a checklist, oh, Turnbull, Colin Turnbull, that was his name. And you know, the way anthropologists usually do it. His was more what was called pejoratively a subjectivist approach. So he actually lived with these people for 3 years and experienced firsthand their experience. And so when somebody would have a trauma, usually it was the loss of somebody close to them, the whole group would come together, and all night long they would cry together. And then at the light of day, they would go into the forest and they would dance in ecstasy. But they did this in community. They shared the grief, and they shared the joy. And this is one of the things that I've learned from different shamans of how that is important in shamanic culture, early shamanic cultures. And in a way, they were probably the progenitors of religion as we know it. But like many things, some of that got lost. And now I think one of the people, I know I'm jumping around here a little bit, one of the people who wrote a blurb about the book wrote the transformation of trauma uniting science and shamanism. This is actually a neurobiologist, psychiatrist, neurobiologist. And, you know, I think we have so much to learn. And I realized that the development of somatic experience, although it's credited to me, I was supported by these other people, as you mentioned, like Ida Rolf, and how much I learned from them and how much I need to acknowledge their guidance and their support.
Yeah, and then taking that, right, and then bringing it into your experiences and your story, and then like now being able to share that for other people. I have to
Right.
tell you, one of the coolest things that I read in there was that you crossed paths with the Hans Selye. I didn't
Yeah,
expect to see that in there.
I did. But that also is a long story there.
uh,
We have time, but I'll give you a brief summary. When I was doing my dissertation, accumulated stress, reserve capacity, and this dash ease, the chairman, uh, uh, because I was bringing together disparate fields from physics, from mathematics, from psychology, from autonomic physiology, that there were too many different avenues, and that it therefore wasn't legitimate.
yeah, he was going to keep you out, right? He said,
He was,
like, oh,
yeah,
yeah, you're
oh,
not
my
getting
dead
it.
body,
Yeah.
you're not going to get your thesis. So there was somebody on the committee that was a good friend of mine. And he said, this is Ed Jackson said, well, he said, Dick, that was his name, Dick, Richard Stroman. You know, I'm not saying that that they're similar, but you know, when I read Einstein and how he comes to his theories, it seems a little bit crazy to me. And he said, why don't we send this to each of the people who are in each of these fields? So one of the people they sent it to was Hans Selye.
Mm.
And he was very supportive. Actually, he wrote a letter to Stroman saying that this was the most important contribution in this half of the century in the field of stress. And even though I disagreed with Selye, because Selye was more like you wear and tear model of stress, you wear your body out. Mine was looking more at resilience and how to evoke resilience. But again, he was really so very kind. And he sent me this volume about this thick on articles on stress. And we corresponded for a while. And one of the things that I was most taken by him and I could relate to the most is that, when he was a young medical student, the professors would take one patient after another, and they all were diagnosed with different diseases. But Selye made the observation, because the emperor has no clothes, observation, that they all looked sick. And it was this, what I saw as accumulating stress, which was happening, which was there in the lack of bounce back of resilience. So he was a very important person. He was also a Hungarian. I think he was a Hungarian Jew. And that's another side story about my father when he visited his relatives in Hungary at the beginning of World War II.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, because I remember, I mean, I have his book on stress back here. And
Sure.
I remember, I'm sure he could probably relate to you because they came at him pretty hard when
Yes,
he was. So you got to stick
right.
together.
Exactly. He almost didn't get through medical school
Yeah.
because he thought he was saying was outlandish. But it's okay. He published and he went ahead in his life and he became famous. And
Mm.
and even more importantly, he was willing to let go of some of his theory, when it was challenged. And I would hope that when people challenge some of my theories and add different approaches to my work, that I'll also be as generous as he was to
Oh,
me.
I'm sure you will be. Yeah, that's the way it evolves, right? Right.
Mhm.
So, what's going to be on your schedule for things coming in the remainder of the year here with the book
Okay.
and
Well,
teaching?
again, there's the publisher is doing a lot of work with that. And so I've done a number of interviews. Actually, next month, I'm actually going to do a book signing in a local bookstore, which is really cool
Oh,
because,
those are great. You
yeah,
have a lot of
yeah,
fun there.
yeah, I really miss bookstores. When I was in Berkeley, there were 20 bookstores. Last time I was there was one. I was heartbroken. I really was. Um, but anyhow, um, uh, I'm continuing to develop my work. I teach. During the summertime, I live in Switzerland and teach there. Um, and I actually am working on two other books. One book now is called Trauma and Spirituality, Resilience and the Human Spirit. And I'm working on that with a Danish colleague of mine from near Copenhagen. So we're working on that together. And then I'm writing another book on healthy sex for adolescents, a book for parents to read together with
Mm.
their teenagers, and the one just for the teenagers. So those are two projects. And my dear friend Mira, I kept her alive by giving her more of ideas of books to write. She's also one of the four most important people in my life. And so I don't know, maybe in a way it's kind of like keeping myself engaged. I mean, for me, writing is a meditation. I
Mm.
mean, here with the book, it was a very more than it was a profound revelation. And and people want more information about somatic experiencing, and because we have I have like 60 trainers that teach in 44 different countries. So if you go to somatic experiencing one word.com, you can get all kinds of information on events and interviews that I've done, YouTube things. I've never seen them, but people say they do.
Mm.
And then there's also a list with the Trauma Healing Organization, SCI, Somatic Experiencing International, where they list trainings in these different countries and also therapists that are working in different places. And so they can go to the website. Also, I think my books are also mentioned on the somatic experiencing website. So they can get more information on that. And I do occasionally do public events. I'm really kind of winding down. I do maybe one or two master classes in US and two or three in Europe, where they're really postgraduate classes. So
Right.
that's basically what I'm doing. And the main project here is to have a good time,
There
to
you go. That's
follow
the
my
top of the list one right there.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And we'll absolutely, everyone listening, we'll put links to it in the show notes so you can find everything. Okay. And of course, you can pick up all of Dr. Levine's work at bookstores. You can find one and Amazon and as well. And I believe you have social media presence as well. I think the Instagram, I believe you have
Yeah, I
that.
believe so. I don't do that, so somebody does it
Well,
for me.
whoever does it, you have to give them some props because they really are enjoyable posts, and I like them quite a bit. Very insightful.
Oh,
And
okay. All right, good. I'll show you one more thing. The last chapter in my book, and I don't know if it's my last chapter in my life, is called Living My Dying.
mm,
And living through the eye of the needle. And what I do is I come back to this child, this 18 months old, two-year-old child who was just full of life and vitality. And as I start living towards my dying, he comes up in a way that really opens my heart. So if it's okay with you, one of the photographs in the book is,
yes,
yeah.
yep, that's it.
So, yeah,
That
that's my connection to my inner child, to my child period. So, okay, so listen, Perry, I've got to get off right now and
absolutely. Thank
enjoyed
you
our
so much.
conversation. Yeah, enjoyed our conversation.
I did too. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank
Oh,
you, Doctor.
you're welcome, Perry.